It is nice to meet all of you. My name is Sarah Truby, and I'm a Habitat Conservation Manager with Sky Island Alliance. Today, I am joining you from Tucson, Arizona, where the Sky Island Alliance office sits on the lands of the Tohono Pasquayaki, and additional indigenous peoples. If you'd like to learn more about these lands, my colleague Rick will be pasting a link in the chat for you to be able to learn more about these lands. I also want to give a shout out to, in the past month, we have had 26 new volunteers join us. We had a lot of events along the border doing a bio blitz to figure out how many species are there and to really catalog all those species. And so as I read their first names out really quickly, I would love if you gave them a visual round of applause, emoji reacts, whatever strikes your fancy. We were joined this last month for the first time by Alejandra, Dre, Christian, Daniel, Deb, Del, Destiny, Diana, Eric, Joe, Casey, Katie, Keith, Linda, and another Linda, Lauren, Madison, and a second Madison, Mari, Mariano, Naomi, Rachel, Rebecca, Rory, Tammy, and Ty. Thank you all so much for joining us this past month. We are so excited. I hope some of you folks are on the coffee break today, and we hope to see you out there again with us soon. All right, but back to the topic at hand. I'm excited to introduce Betsy Grube, who I recently got to attend a workshop with on fish, and I learned so much. Betsy is the top minnow and pupfish specialist with the Arizona Game and Fish Department. She spends much of her time reintroducing top minnow species, pupfish species, and other endangered fish back into waters in Arizona. Today, Betsy will tell us all about our native fish and their natural history here in Arizona, as well as steps that are being taken today to protect and restore fish populations across the state. As a reminder, we'd like to ask you to remain muted during the presentation, but please feel free at any time to type questions into the chat. And then at the end, we'll make sure to send those along to Betsy and discuss those. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to you, Betsy, and please take it away.
Yeah, hi, good morning, everyone. So like she said, my name is Betsy Grube. I'm a native fish biologist. I primarily work with top minnow and pupfish species in Arizona for the Arizona Game and Fish Department. Today, I'm mostly going to be talking very generally about how we manage and recover native species here in Arizona, with an emphasis on Gila top minnow and desert pupfish and the unique tools that we have here in Arizona for recovering those species. Let's see. There we go. So as many of you guys know, being involved with Sky Island Alliance, for thousands of years, Arizona's native fishes have adapted to lives and habitats ranging from the raging Colorado River to small spring habitats. And their fish's ability to adjust to periods of drought and flash floods is truly a marvel and really a big key to their survival. The photo on the left is obviously the Colorado River, the largest river in Arizona and commonly called the lifeline of the West. It supplies water to many southwestern states, and I'm sure many of y'all have seen it in the news as of late. In contrast to that, we have the photos on the right, which are a series of small spring pools. The top photo is actually a picture of the spring back from the 90s when it was once really fall. And the bottom photo is an aerial imagery of what is considered a high flow event for this particular spring. Today, the spring looks like a series of isolated spring pools only about 5 to 20 feet wide and are generally disconnected. So I show these photos to show that we manage a variety of waters and our fish are found in a variety of waters throughout Arizona. So speaking of fish, we have about 35 fish native to Arizona, depending on how you classify them. And they have a variety of adaptations that make them suitable for our extreme state. I've included some illustrations of some of my favorite fish here. But part of this presentation was initially supposed to encompass kind of a section identification. I don't think I'll have time to really get into every species identification, but my quick and dirty tip is to look at the shape of the fish to determine if they're native or non-native in Arizona. So looking at all these photos or all these illustrations, you can see that our native species are very shallow bodied. They're not very deep bodied fish. They're very torpedo shaped, for lack of a better term. There's a few exceptions to this, like the desert pupfish, but for the most part, that seems to be the rule. And when comparing them to non-native fish, seen here on the left side of the screen, you can see that the non-natives are very deep-bodied and they often have spiny fins. So on the right side of the screen, we've got chub and Sonora suckers that are very streamlined, torpedo-shaped, compared to the non-native green sunfish and bass, which are deep-bodied. And this is in part due to the hydrology of Arizona. We're mostly a stream state, and we actually don't have many natural lakes, only 2 in the entire state. So that's my quick and dirty identification tip, but we can move on to the fun, unique adaptations of a lot of the species that we work with here in Arizona. I'm just going to go through some of our fish, just to talk about how they've developed through time. To start, we'll talk about some of my favorites, loach minnow and spike dace. Loach minnow and spike dace are both native to the Gila River Basin and are classified as federally endangered. They've been extirpated from over 80% of their native ranges here in Arizona. And in response to this, the department has developed many new management techniques to attempt to increase their distribution throughout the state. So both of these species possess unique characteristics that are not found in other species, at least locally here in Arizona. So to start, the loach minnow actually has a reduced swim bladder. Normally fish have a swim bladder that they're able to kind of control how much air goes in and out of it, so that they're able to kind of control where they are in the water column. Loach minnow have a reduced swim bladder, and this really helps in their preferred habitat, which is ripples with higher velocity. And because of this reduced swim bladder, they're able to kind of sink to the bottom of the river and kind of push against the current rather than go with it a lot easier than other fish do. So although they lack this organ, they're still able to kind of persist in the water column, and it makes them a lot more resilient to high flow events, high velocity events, and makes the flooding, which is natural to Arizona streams, a part of their life cycle. So it's a really interesting adaptation. The spike dace, on the other hand, has a different kind of adaptation. The species, they occupy a variety of habitats. You'll often see them in pool habitats, right where maybe a run is coming in or a riffle section is coming into the pool. They, in response to predation in the past, they've developed this dorsal spine or spike, which is where they get the name spike dace. There's much speculation as to exactly why they have this spike. Although one theory is that it was a predation defense mechanism. If a predator was to eat this fish, in the past, they would bite down and they'd have a spike at the top of their mouth. And the reason that the species is federally endangered in part is due to habitat alteration, but also predation from non-native predators. So the spike probably worked a lot better back in the day for our native predators. So speaking of native predators, just quickly, we also want to show you some fish with some unique adaptations. On the other end of the spectrum, the Colorado pike minnow and razorback sucker, which are also federally endangered, but 2 of the larger fish that we have native here to Arizona. The pike minnow can grow up to 6 feet long. Razorbacks are much, much smaller, typically 3 feet or less. So jumping into the background on the guys, like I said, pike minnow, they used to get very large. They're not quite 6 feet long anymore. And people commonly mistake the term minnow with small bodied in size, when the reality is that it's just a classification for a particular set of teeth placement kind of close to the back of their throat. So minnow doesn't necessarily mean small fish, so the Colorado pike minnow isn't necessarily a misnomer. This species used to be an apex predator in rivers and streams throughout the Southwest and was famously called the white salmon by some settlers. So although they're an endangered fish now, people used to really enjoy eating them back in the day. So moving on to the razorback suckers, this species, it's not quite as large as the Colorado pike minnow, nor is it a predator, although it is one of our more unique fish and probably one of the cuter fish that we have in the state. The species developed a bony keel on the top of its head, as you can see prominently in the photo on the right side of the screen. And like a lot of the adaptations, we aren't sure the exact reason why this was developed, although it is believed to either help the fish stabilize in higher velocity waters or potentially a defense mechanism. So another set of predators we have, just kidding, but some of my favorite fish in the state are desert pupfish and Gila top minnow. They're the most extreme fish in terms of what they can handle. They're both endangered and extirpated from the majority of their ranges, similar to the other species that I've already gone over. At the time of listing, Gila top minnow had been reduced to only about 15 relic sites in Arizona, and desert pupfish had been completely extirpated from the wild and were exclusively in captive locations when they were listed. So desert pupfish, as much as I joke about them being a predator, they really are incredibly vicious and aggressive fish. As the story goes, they got their names because an ichthyologist or biologist was watching them kind of defend these territories that they set up, and they thought they looked playful like puppies as they were viciously chasing off each other and defending their homes. But they're also one of our most extreme fish in Arizona. They can survive in waters about up to 110 degrees Fahrenheit, which is absolutely insane when you think about the thresholds for other fish. For instance, if you were to even mention 100 degrees Fahrenheit to a trout, they might just roll over and die on the spot. The Gila top minnow, on the other hand, is really exciting because it's the only native fish in Arizona, native to Arizona, that gives birth to live young. Consequently, they're incredibly prolific and can triple their numbers in one season given the opportunity. They have this live birth because they have this modified anal fin called a gonopodium, where the males are actually able to do internal fertilization. So they're a really unique and interesting species because of that, but they also harbor a lot of the same extreme thresholds that desert pupfish do. Their temperature threshold isn't quite as high, but they can survive in really terrible water quality conditions that aren't suitable for other species. For instance, dissolved oxygen conditions as low as 2 milligrams per liter. Anecdotally, I found them in ponds that was detecting less than 2 milligrams per liter, with pockets of maybe 2 or 3 milligrams per liter that they were really using to survive. So they're really a fascinating species and able to thrive in locations other fish would not be able to. I could continue talking about unique things in the Southwest that fishes for the entirety of this talk, but I just wanted to point out how strange and interesting some of our fishes in the Southwest are. Something that I commonly read in a lot of literature about Southwestern fishes is that native fish in the Southwest have low diversity, but a high degree of endemism, which simply means we don't have a lot of native fish species, but the ones we do have are found almost nowhere else. And with that being said, native fish management in the Southwest is very important, as if we lose some of these very interesting, unique, and frankly weird fish, they won't just be gone from Arizona, but they could be gone from the entire world. So what is the status of these really cool fish today? In general, our native fish haven't been doing great. On the screen, I have a list of all of our native species here in Arizona, with threatened and endangered species highlighted in red, and our only extinct fish in Arizona highlighted in black. We've had a couple other species that we believe to be extirpated from Arizona, but are not yet extinct, at least not yet recognized as extinct. The only species that has gone extinct in Arizona is the Santa Cruz pupfish, also known as the Monkey Springs pupfish. As the story goes, it had become isolated to a single spring in southern Arizona, and the private landowner who owned and managed the spring introduced bass that quickly wiped out the population. Non-natives and our tiny little native fish often don't do well, and they can only coexist together for a very brief amount of time before the natives are completely extirpated. The Santa Cruz pupfish wasn't even formally described until after it was already extinct. So the current status and decline of Arizona native fishes has been well documented. I've included some textbooks here up on the screen, or some books that I recommend if you guys are interested in kind of reading more about the specific history of our native fishes battle against extinction. Is a really well done book that has a lot of examples of native fish conservation and the decline of native fish species. So why are these fish doing so poorly? As I spoke about already, habitat loss for some species has been a major issue, such as the spike dace. Our landscape has changed drastically in the last 100, 200 years, as I'm sure all of you are aware. We've obviously had dams and water diversions, along with groundwater pumping and urbanization and land use change through agriculture and people moving to the Southwest. We've developed complex canal structures to divert water and move around the state, and all that has had impacts to the habitat of native fish. So some of those impacts, despite what the Arizona looks like today, it was historically, like I said, a stream state with only 2 natural lakes. And a lot of our lakes are dammed or modified canyons or stream channels. And that's one of the major land use changes that has modified habitat for native fish. So on the photo I have on the left, the famous Glen Canyon Dam. And like I said, many of Arizona's lakes are actually just dammed canyons. It's funny, I was talking to someone only a few weeks ago about this, and they were just so mesmerized by this idea that the lakes that they grew up familiar with were not natural. And they're like, even a lake like Rose Canyon Lake on Mount Lemmon? And I was like, Rose Canyon Lake is a dammed canyon. So it's always funny to hear what people's perspectives are of what's natural and what's not. Just because you don't see the dam doesn't mean it's not there. On the right, I have a much less famous water. It's called Kotang Drainage. It's a tributary to Red Rock Canyon, which was historically a very iconic helitopmino site. And managers of this area actually had well documented the decline of the distribution of water throughout the canyon, and what used to be kilometers and kilometers of suitable habitat for helitopmino and other native species was reduced to less than 40 meters of water when I last visited in June of 2021. So there's been a lot of drastic changes to the landscape over the years that have, from a fish's perspective, been absolutely detrimental to their persistence. And then came the introduction of non-native fish. So on top of all the landscape changes, all of our native fish now have new neighbors. So fisheries management, it used to look a lot differently back in Arizona's early days and the early days of the West. There was something called the train car days, which is where managers to kind of provide new opportunities for sport fishing opportunities that people were familiar with, drove around on railroad cars, often dropping fish off whenever they crossed a stream or things like that to introduce sport fishing opportunities. Additionally, illegal stockings of aquarium fish and sport fish, and the natural dispersion of non-native species through our new Bright and Shiny canal systems has distributed non-natives throughout the Southwest and Arizona particularly. In modern day, Game and Fish has developed a watershed management plan with our partners at local, state, and federal levels to kind of identify management goals for specific waterways so that we no longer have this kind of Wild West outlook of non-native versus native fish introductions. Waters are typically identified as either a sport fishing opportunity or native fish management. So nonetheless, the landscape has drastically changed, and a lot of our fish have new neighbors that are ultimately unfamiliar to them. And with these new neighbors, there's a lot of issues that may arise. So like I've already spoke about, a lot of our fish are very small. Desert pupfish, helitopmino are typically only 2 inches. A loach minnow, even a massive one, might be like 4 or 5 inches max. And our suckers and things like that get a little bigger aren't necessarily used to being with predators that are as aggressive as like a bass or even a sunfish. So predation has been a big issue for native fish as non-natives have been introduced to the landscape. Non-natives also outcompete for food and other resources, such as the helitopmino and the western mosquito fish, which I'll get to a little later. There's opportunities for hybridization, which has been a big issue for native trout management as non-native trout hybridize with native trout. And then there's also been the introduction of new diseases and pathogens as non-natives have been introduced to the landscape. This is particularly an issue for people releasing aquarium fish or fish that have been held in close quarters with other species, as they tend to be the ones that have new diseases or pathogens that our native fish either are unfamiliar with, haven't evolved to be with, or are new to the system entirely. So it's not all doom and gloom. I'm not going to leave you all on that. Managers have been doing a lot to recover these species. I'm going to talk generally about recovery efforts, and then I'm going to move on to some recovery strategies that we have that are unique to Arizona that I am really excited about and really passionate about today. So recovery, for the most part, can be divided into 2 main groups for our species, which is 1, preserving existing populations. This often looks like securing the natural populations from risk of habitat loss through water diversions or things like that, and protecting the land they're on, protecting and removing non-natives if they happen to get into any kind of system that our native fish are in, maintaining refuge stocks in captive facilities in case of catastrophic events. Additionally, we also introduce and establish new populations across the historic ranges for all the species. And we do this by identifying suitable waters, removing any kind of threat to the species, such as a non-native, and stocking them. So non-natives have been a big part of this discussion. It's hard to talk about any native fish in the Southwest without talking about the role that non-natives have played on it. There's this kind of iconic quote by W.L. Minkley, who's been a famous fish biologist in the South, who was a famous fish biologist in the Southwest, that I think really highlights the need to manage non-natives for native fish recovery. And the quote is, "Native fish of the American West will not remain on Earth without active management. And I argue forcefully that control of non-indigenous warm water species is the single most important requirement for achieving that goal." And that's definitely a big point of issue for native fish managers here in Arizona. I would say anywhere from 25 to 50% of any given manager's time is spent actively removing non-natives or planning non-native removals or having conversations about it in that point. It's a big part of our native fish management. There's no way to get around it. So that's why it's important to keep sport fish in their identified waters and not move them around, not move around bait buckets or introduce aquarium fish into any kind of system. In addition, when we're protecting these natural populations, we don't just protect the water that they're in or protect them from non-natives. We can actually build permanent barriers, such as barriers that Bureau of Reclamation built to further protect these fish against the introduction of non-natives through natural dispersal. I've identified some fish barriers up on the screen in the years they were built. These ones particularly were aimed at Gila top minnow, with the years the Gila top minnow stocked indicated under them, but there's other barriers throughout the state focused on other species, such as the ones in Aravaipa Creek. There's a iconic fish barrier there that's aimed at protecting like loach minnow, spike dace, and round-tailed chub. So if we can't protect a natural population, we've already lost it, we can always reestablish populations or start new ones. And this always sounds like a fairly straightforward process, but I just kind of wanted to break down all the steps that go into it because there really is a lot of planning. We obviously have these watershed management plans, which identify how we're allowed to use the waters that we've already coordinated with our partners. And our first step is to go to the waters that we've identified and see if they're actually suitable for the species that we intend. Here are some waters that we've kind of evaluated in the last couple of years. And eventually most of them been able to stock with native fish. So each native fish has unique requirements that we're generally looking for. For loach minnows, I talked about, they are riffle species. They dwell in riffles. They can handle higher velocities a lot better, and they actually need that more so than other species. In contrast, the Gila top minnow cannot handle high velocities in the slightest, truly. So we're typically looking for slower moving water, areas with refuge from high velocity or flooding events, some degree of shading and things like that. We also typically go out during the driest time of the year. So you'll typically see us wet dry mapping in the middle of June, looking to see what the minimum habitat looks like for any kind of potential water that we'd like to introduce fish into. We're also verifying that as much as the habitat is suitable, that there's no non-native fish there that might be an issue for the natives that we want to identify. And typically, if there's a non-native fish, we have to either identify a barrier that we could remove the fish up to, or a source population that we can remove, and then we have to do years and years of removal projects for mechanical removals for non-native fish. So we have a lot of options for donor populations for native species once we've identified a water. We obviously have wild-to-wild transfers, which is really a great opportunity, but to protect some of our relic wild populations that have been kind of long-lasting and to not have detrimental effects to them, we have other opportunities such as captive facilities, either hatcheries that Human Fish runs or that Fish and Wildlife Service runs, or facilities that our partners have been raising fish in. We work closely with the Phoenix Zoo, who raise desert pupfish and Gila top minnow, and also the Sonoran Desert Museum, who recently started raising Sonora chub. We also have other captive ponds that we've been able to kind of establish native species in that we're able to pull from to further establish additional wild populations. And I'll get more into that a little later on. Stocking the fish always sounds like it's going to be the easiest part. Typically when we're stocking fish, we're collecting them from anywhere from 1 to 5 donor locations, depending on how plentiful the fish is and what our management goals are for the genetic recovery of the species. A lot of the sites we are also working in are very remote, very pristine, very untouched. So we often have to hike miles and miles back with fish packed on our backs on pack frames, or have fish helicoptered in or brought in by horseback. So the stocking of the fish can tend to be a very laborious process. And finally, there's no point in stocking fish if you don't monitor them in return to see how they're doing, to make sure they've established and kind of get an idea for what the benchmark is. We typically monitor fish for 3 years post-stocking, and then put them on a 2 to 3 year monitoring rotation, depending on the site and the landowner. Typically, when we're monitoring, we're not only looking to see if fish are still present, but also how catch per unit effort is changing over time, what the trends are, and also looking for reproduction and that the population is self-sustaining before we can determine if they're established or not. And that typically takes 3 years of consecutive monitoring before we can say a site has successfully established. So that's the general part of this presentation, and kind of generally how we manage native fish. Something that I'm really excited about are the additional opportunities that we have for Gila top minnow and desert pupfish and other top minnow and pupfish species here in Arizona that other states or other species might not have. The first one might be a little surprising. It's vector control. Like I said, we have a lot of unique tools in our toolbox. And this one is one of my favorites in terms of its uniqueness. So vector control is specifically thinking about mosquitoes. There's the West Nile virus and Zika virus that can be transmitted through mosquitoes. Part of the mosquito life cycle is mosquito larvae, which is aquatic, so it's in water. And mosquito larvae and mosquitoes can be treated with pesticides, BTI, removed in water, or commonly introducing mosquito fish. You can see I have this photo of a Western mosquito fish and a Gila top minnow on the screen. I'll get more into it a little bit later, but based on how similar they look, you can assume that they occupy a very similar niche. Western mosquito fish is non-native to Arizona, but it's been introduced across the world. The first known introductions took place in the early 1900s, and it was still being actively stocked in the CAP canals when they were being built in the 1980s. This is a funny photo to me always. It's a monument in Russia that's praising mosquito fish's assistance in kind of stifling the flight of malaria. So they're definitely a hero for many, but a villain to me. They've become a pest in a lot of waterways here in Arizona. They're extremely aggressive. They eat eggs of desirable fish. Often if you see them in mixed habitats with top minnow and mosquito fish coexisting, you'll see that the top minnow have shredded fins, in part due to the mosquito fish. They're still actively stocked by a lot of agencies today. They're not a nuisance fish that were illegally stocked. They're often legally stocked by agencies. And they've been determined one of the 100 worst invasive species in the world. So while they've been very helpful and kind of discouraging the plight of vector-borne illnesses, they've been really detrimental to our native species. It's been well documented that once a Western mosquito fish is kind of introduced into a system, the Gila top minnow will slowly decline over time and eventually the population will crash. This can happen very quickly in a lot of situations, especially smaller systems, or it can happen over years and years. This was one of the more recent papers I could find by Doug Duncan, and it kind of outlines some populations in the Santa Cruz Basin and how the rise of Western mosquito fish ultimately led to the decline of the Gila top minnow at these sites. Western mosquito fish still actively introduced into Arizona. This article is from 2017, where an agency was introducing them into the Salt River Project to combat vector-borne illnesses. Just a quick Google search will find non-native Western mosquito fish available just via the internet, or they're handed out by a lot of different public health services. So They're a huge problem in the state of Arizona currently, and we still have counties that give them out for free in bags to private citizens. However, there's been some research that's gone into comparing the Gila top minnow and western mosquito fish as agents of biological control. And what research has found is that they're very similar in terms of their effectiveness at removing mosquito larvae from the water, which is really exciting because it's kind of opened up this new opportunity for Gila top minnow to be used as vector control. So Pima County in 2017 became the first county in Arizona to use Gila top minnow for vector control. And it's very exciting because this is one of the only programs that I'm aware of that uses endangered fish for vector control in Arizona. So it's very exciting. And with the success that Pima County brought in 2017, we also have Pinal County coming on board with the same program in 2019, and 2 other counties currently interested in going through the process of becoming enrolled today. And like I said, this project is one of the first of its kinds to be using endangered fish for vector control. And with the success that we've seen at the county level, we've had private citizens approaching us for interest in using Gila top minnow as vector control in private ranches or private like agriculture systems and things like that. And it's been a really great opportunity to not only reduce the use of western mosquito fish and reduce their stocking in the landscape, but to increase awareness about Gila top minnow and provide some value to the Gila top minnow. So if people can't appreciate their intrinsic value, at least they can appreciate the hard work that they do. So another element that we're able to kind of conserve desert pupfish or pupfish species and top minnow species in Arizona, and kind of goes hand in hand with the vector control program, is through safe harbor agreements. So a safe harbor agreement is the agreement between U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Arizona Game and Fish that was developed under the service's Safe Harbor Agreement Final Regulations and Final Policy. The agreement covers the historical ranges of Gila top minnow, Yaqui top minnow, desert pupfish, and Quito Paquito pupfish on non-federal lands in Arizona. And under this agreement, the department issues a certificate of inclusion to non-federal property owners or cooperators who voluntarily agree to carry out conservation actions on their property. This often and almost exclusively looks like them either not stocking non-natives and stocking Gila top minnow for vector control, or hosting the species in private ponds on their property. So in return for this voluntary conservation commitment, the agreement extends assurances to cooperators for allowing for future alterations in their property or withdrawal from the program if they're no longer interested. And like I said, it's really exciting because it allows non-federal partners who otherwise wouldn't have the opportunity to participate in conservation of the species to either host them on their property. And it provides these private landowners with protection from the ESA in the form of take. They're allowed to go about their day-to-day activities in management of their ponds and waters and return to baseline conditions if they're no longer interested in participating in the program. So there's a lot of incentive for folks to kind of get involved and host native fish on their property, specifically endangered native fish. We have a lot of people participating in this program across the state. We have about 30 landowners, and these landowners obviously vary from private citizens to schools, non-government organizations, private corporations, non-federal. So, oh shoot, I hope I didn't freeze too much there.
It was only for a second. You're good.
Okay, good. So city and county governments, specifically Pima and Pinal County, are both enrolled under the Safe Harbor Agreement, but also cities like the city of Tucson, city of Prescott, and folks like that have fish in either public or private ponds that are available for people to see. And additionally, the Arizona Game and Fish is also enrolled in this program in select wildlife areas like Robbins View Wildlife Area, where we have top minnow and pupfish ponds across the wildlife area. There's a lot of benefits to this program. Some of them might be very obvious. If the ponds are large enough and the populations are large enough, they're able to count towards recovery of the species. Even if they're not large enough to count towards the recovery, they still act as insurance against catastrophic events. Habitat loss is a real thing, and like you see, a lot of streams are drying. We're able to kind of replicate relic populations and captive populations across the state so that if something were to happen to our relic or wild sites, we're able to restart the population. These captive sites also act as a source population of future stockings, like I talked about earlier. For top minnow pupfish specifically, we often go to 1 to 5 sites when starting a new population, and those are often captive sites that have been stocked directly from the relic source. The Safe Harbor Agreement also reduces the need to stock Western mosquito for vector control. Western mosquito, again, are a huge issue for the Gila top minnow. So any kind of reduction in their stocking is massive for the success of the top minnow. And finally, it increases the public awareness of native fish and their recovery. It's difficult to ask people to value a species they've never heard about or don't know anything about or can't even see. So a lot of our Safe Harbor Agreement sites at city and county locations are public ponds, public parks that people can go to, see the fish and learn about the species. And I can't underscore how important this tool has been to the recovery of desert pupfish and top minnow species in Arizona. This program only really came on board in about 2008, and we have since had a huge overhaul in how many populations that we have. So out of about 100 populations of Gila top minnow that we have in Arizona, about 31% of them are on private lands. So 1/3 of our top minnow populations are on private lands. For Yaqui top minnow, it's a little less. We only have about 20 populations of Yaqui top minnow in Arizona, and about 9% are on private lands. But for pupfish, like the desert pupfish, we only have about 50 populations, and about half of those are on private land. And same for the Sonota pupfish, where we only have about 10 populations in Arizona. So it's been massive in terms of the success of the species and the success of the recovery. These aren't your traditional wild sites, but the captive ponds are incredibly important to replicating and reducing the likelihood of the species going extinct. And in part because of the success of this program, Game and Fish in 2019 petitioned to downlist Gila top minnow, and they're currently undergoing the species status assessment to see the current status of the species. So everyone stay tuned on how that goes. So I mostly want to talk about the Safe Harbor Agreement. I know a lot of you all work closely with Sky Island Alliance. You do a lot of volunteer working. There's the Spring Seeker program, and we're always looking for new locations for top minnow and pupfish species. We have kind of a general criteria, but we're incredibly flexible in terms of what we're actually looking for, as long as it's suitable water quality. We have a minimum size of 600 feet squared, and that's mainly because we want to monitor all these populations on a 2 or 3 year rotation. And the more and more populations we add, the more difficult that becomes. But we're incredibly flexible, and if it's a small pond but has suitable habitat, we're more than willing to accommodate that. Max depth of 6.6 feet. We obviously prefer sand or gravel substrate, but we also worked with sites that we had exposed liner or cement or some other source. The water source is kind of non-negotiable. It must be free of non-native fish and suitable for fish. And additionally, any kind of filtration or piping must be screened so that juveniles can't escape or get sucked up. And the pond cannot be hydrologically connected to other sites. The idea of these Shaw sites, Safe Harbor Agreement sites, is that they're either captive or isolated in terms of a spring pond or captive pond, or maybe isolated stream segment that can escape the property. So that when fish aren't stocked, they're not going on to other private landowners' property or another agency's property that we didn't necessarily get permission to have these species on. So if anyone knows anyone that's interested in Safe Harbor agreements or wants to participate in conservation by hosting endangered species on their property, they can feel free to reach out to me, and I'll provide my email at the end of this presentation. So I can't, in good faith, talk about native fish conservation and recovery without also talking about aquatic diseases and pathogens. So for me, I follow a hazard analysis and critical control point process, which is HACCP. And in short, it's a plan to reduce risk. It involves describing each task that I'm going to do in terms of monitoring, translocations, things like that, and identifying potential targets or non-targets such as disease or pathogens that I could accidentally transport, and then performing a risk assessment and justification for this risk and how to reduce risk. So this is important to talk about and to think about for anyone who's monitoring a site, evaluating a site, going between waters in any kind of inner watershed situation, and it's important to emphasize. it helps stop the spread of pathogens. We have a lot of pathogens currently here in Arizona. Yellow grub, ick, lernia, fungal infection, black spot are all kind of specific to aquatic fish. We have on the top of the screen a photo of a cichlid with ick, characterized by these white spots. We actually recently had a top minnow and pupfish site come down with ick and is now ick positive, and there's no way to cheaply treat ick in an entire pond system. This bottom photo also has top minnow with black grub on it, indicated by those little black spots. And there's a lot of concerns with disease and pathogens because a lot of the sites that our native fish are in are very limited. And so a disease or pathogen can rapidly spread through the entire system, potentially causing a population crash. Certain pathogens also eliminate the opportunity for the fish to be used for either future augmentations, translocation events, or limit the opportunity for what fish can and can't be stocked there. There's also non-fish specific diseases and pathogens that are important to be aware of, like ranavirus, chytrid, things like that are also reduced when you focus on critical control points and properly cleaning and sanitizing gear. And obviously this also stops the spread of other organisms, vegetation, which I'm sure you all are familiar with, eggs, tadpoles, tiny offspring, things that can get stuck in the in your fingers, in your gear, on the tread of your boots, things like that. So for most monitoring, evaluation, surveys, even hikes, the critical control point is moving gear between waters. Anything that gets wet, it could be as obvious as obviously a trap I'm putting in the water to my boots that I got wet when I was walking up a stream. All of those things need to be properly sanitized or cleaned before moving into a different water. So what I do is I do a process called rinse, squat, rinse, where I thoroughly clean the gear, visually inspect it if there's nothing on there, and then I apply a quaternary ammonium chloride solution to the entire gear. I let it sit for 5 to 10 minutes. For whatever kind of solution you're using, even for your own home, for like Clorox wipes or things like that, they have a specific contact time that is needed for the solution to really be effective. And then after the contact time is reached, I can rinse off the product and it's once again safe for fish. Another alternative is a 10% bleach solution with a minimal option of complete drying in direct sunlight. And like I said, this could be something as simple as wet boots that you're using, walking between waters as part of the Spring Seeker program, or something like a hike. And obviously the threat of moving pathogens or diseases between waters, you can kind of personally assess to some degree. If you're in the same watershed, maybe within, a couple kilometers or so, and it seems reasonable to assume wildlife or aquatics are moving between those waters, not an issue. But if you're getting in your car, driving between watersheds, moving between significant water bodies or water bodies where there's known diseases or pathogens, it's something to consider. And that's really all I have. I know this was a very general presentation. I greedily want to talk about every fish, but top minnow and pupfish are really my focus. And I think we have a lot of exciting tools to be able to use for these species. So if anyone has any questions, now's the time to ask. I also have my email up on the screen, egrube@azgfd. If you know of anyone who might be interested in either top minnow or pupfish for vector control or for a safe harbor agreement.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Betsy. That was great. I think folks will probably have some questions, and so feel free to type those in the chat. I also think I want to share my favorite fish is now either the loach minnow, because I like that they have this special adaptation for faster moving water, or the Colorado pike minnow, because that fish seems terrifying and you want to keep your enemies close. I don't know, the idea of a 6-foot fish is just like, oof, that's big. But anyway, I have a couple of questions to get us started as folks are typing them in the chat. So the first one is, thank you, first of all, for talking about, if we're moving between watersheds or between different water sources, what we can do if we're out there hiking to protect our native fish. What are some other things that I can do? Like, are there things I can do at my home, or maybe even things I can do, policy options, get involved in protecting native fish in some other way?
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have maybe the ability to be involved with the safe harbor agreement, maybe you don't have a pond, keeping an eye out for people that do have suitable sites and giving them the word. A lot of people reach out to me by word of mouth that they heard from a friend of a friend of a friend that top manure may be good for vector control. And so that's a major way to get the word out there. Additionally, just education about people about introducing non-native fish. There's a lot of ponds famous in Tucson that people introduce their aquatic organisms to that they no longer want. Agua Caliente Park Pond is a famous example. We had actually been managing that one for top minnow and pupfish, and also formerly known as Gila chub, now round-tailed chub, up until about 6 months ago when mosquito fish were introduced, and then ick was found thanks to the introduction of other aquatic organisms. And short of draining the pond and restarting over, we're not able to really do much in terms of native fish management because of the non-natives and the disease that's been introduced.
Oh, shoot.
So
Okay.
education and outreach is always a good one.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so we have a question from the chat. Have any of the private owners involved in the safe harbor agreement ended their agreements? And if so, do you try and recover the fish before they end the agreement?
Yeah, so we've had a couple of private landowners withdraw for various reasons. We had one landowner that had Keto pupfish or Sonoida pupfish withdraw because they sold their property and wanted to move. And at that time, we can go and we can salvage the fish and move them to a new location, depending on the species that they have. So for that situation, we salvaged them, removed them, brought them to a new location. And then a few years later, when they actually bought a new property, they got a new pond and wanted more fish and re-enrolled in the process. But we've had other landowners that fish need to be salvaged because they're doing maybe significant modification of the pond, relining the ponds, things like that. And we just work closely with them to remove the fish. But there's no penalty for returning to baseline conditions and drying the ponds if they need to.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. I have a question about, so one of our spring seekers, who I think is actually on this call, and I've seen something similar out there as well, reported seeing goldfish in a large stock tank, presumably for either cleaning the water and, eating some of the aquatic material there, or maybe even for vector control. Would top minnow be an alternative in that kind of environment? It's not really a natural environment, but I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so our kind of safe harbor agreements on private ponds and even for like Forest Service and things like that, for federally owned properties, we do occasionally stock more of like stock tank situations. The issue with stock tanks is that non-natives have already been stocked into a lot of them. And so when we're doing non-native removals, we've got to evaluate the entire watershed, which means we've got to go to every single stock tank to verify that they're free of non-natives. And if they are there, remove them. But
Gotcha.
top minnow are definitely, especially if it's like a rancher or someone that has multiple ponds that they're trying to control mosquito larvae at, top minnow are a good option for them.
Gotcha. Very cool. Another question from the chat. Are there any native fish in Reed Park ponds, or are they also dumping grounds for pet fish?
So I don't have any native fish at Reed Park ponds. I think those are mostly illegally stocked or pet fish that have been released there.
That's a bummer. That's the closest park to my house. So
yeah. No, we've got a lot of pupfish ponds and top minnow ponds around Tucson, thanks to Pima County and their involvement in conservation. But a lot of them require constant vigilance in terms of goldfish removals and things like that.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay, well, I have one more question if folks are still typing in the chat. So like, we have a bunch of volunteers going out to springs. We've visited more than 1,000 springs now across the Sky Island region in the last 3 years. Is there anything that we can do, collect photos, videos, anything that we can do to help Game and Fish monitor for either non-native or native fish populations?
Yeah, you can always send an email to myself or the regional aquatic biologist for the Tucson area. That'd be Nate Berg and Sean Jerry, about if you identify a non-native species in any kind of spring system or identify them potentially free of non-natives, but look like they might be suitable for a different native species. That's always helpful, especially if you're doing the monitoring in the summer or during drier months where you're seeing like the minimum habitat and that they're still wet even at the end of June. We're always looking for additional waters to introduce these fish into.
Very cool. Awesome. Fantastic. Well, I'm not seeing any other comments or questions in the chat, but like y'all can see, Betsy's email is up on the screen, and it sounds like you're open to any follow-up questions that might occur to people later. So that sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Betsy, thank you so much for your time this morning. This was fascinating. I am so excited to learn more about fish, and I wanted to wish everybody a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks so much, Betsy.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Bye, everyone. Have a great day.